Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change everything. In a world where power often corrupts and titles create walls between hearts, one gentle invitation would alter two lives forever. Servant Maiden Alva works the great feast in Eldrvik's hall, celebrating their new Jarl, whom no one has seen. She spots a quiet man standing alone at the hall's edge, watching the celebration. Thinking he's just another lonely warrior, she approaches with a shy smile. "Join me at feast," she whispers. "That man is Ragnald Thorsson, the very Jarl they honor tonight. He's returned in secret to see his people before claiming his throne. Touched by her kindness, he accepts without revealing who he really is. Over the coming days, they share meals and laughter, their bond growing deeper. But when the truth comes out before the entire court, everything changes. What happens when a heart given freely discovers it belonged to the most powerful man in the realm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eldrvik's cobblestone streets as Alva Eriksdottir hurried through the village square, her worn leather shoes clicking against the stones. In her weathered hands, she clutched her most precious possession, her mother's wooden spoon, smooth from decades of use, carved with intricate Norse knots that told stories of generations past. The spoon had stirred countless pots of stew that fed hungry families, had been passed from mother to daughter through times of feast and famine, and now it guided Alva's own hands as she prepared meals in the great hall. At 19, Alva possessed the kind of quiet beauty that bloomed slowly, like wildflowers finding their way through rocky soil. Her auburn hair caught the light in copper threads, usually braided with practical efficiency and tucked beneath a simple linen cap. Her green eyes held depths of compassion that seemed older than her years, shaped by a life of service and loss. She had learned early that survival meant making herself useful, invisible when needed, but always ready with a helping hand. The great hall of Eldrvik rose before her like a wooden cathedral, its massive oak beams reaching toward the sky in testament to the craftsmanship of generations past. Carved dragon heads watched from every corner, their eyes seeming to follow visitors with ancient wisdom. The hall could hold 300 souls when packed for celebrations, its long tables stretching the length of the building, each one capable of seating 20 warriors side by side. Tonight, those tables would groan under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and barrels of mead in celebration of their new Jarl's arrival. But this morning, the hall stood mostly empty, except for the constant bustle of preparation. Magnus Ironhand, the head cook, whose beard had gone grey in service to 3 different Jarls, commanded his kitchen staff with the authority of a general preparing for battle. His voice boomed across the space as he directed servants carrying sides of beef, wheels of cheese, and baskets of root vegetables from the winter stores. "Alva, child," Magnus called out, his weathered face softening when he spotted her. "The bread ovens need tending, and those lazy boys have let the fires burn low again. Take young Astrid with you, she's got good hands for the dough." Astrid Gunnarsdottir looked up from where she knelt, scrubbing tables, her blonde braids swinging as she moved. At 16, she possessed an infectious laugh and a tongue sharp enough to cut through pretension, though she wielded both with good humor. She had arrived at the hall only 2 winters ago, orphaned like Alva when raiders took her family's farm, but where Alva had learned caution, Astrid had developed boldness. "Did you hear the stories from the harbor?" Astrid whispered as they worked side by side, kneading the heavy dough that would become tomorrow's bread. "The fishermen say the new Jarl sailed in yesterday evening, but no one caught sight of him. Some say he's grown as tall as a mountain troll, others claim he's been scarred by battles in distant lands." Alva smiled at her friend's eagerness for gossip. "Stories grow wilder with each telling. Remember when they said the last Jarl could speak to ravens?" "Aye, but this one might be different," Astrid continued, lowering her voice further. "They say Ragnald Thorsson fought alongside kings in the eastern kingdoms, that he once held a bridge alone against 50 men. Magnus heard from the stablemaster that his ship carries wealth enough to rebuild the village twice over. The mention of rebuilding struck a chord in Alva's heart. She had watched Eldrvik struggle under the previous Jarl's neglect, seen families leave for better prospects in other settlements, witnessed the proud hall slowly falling into disrepair. Broken shutters went unmended, the dock needed reinforcement before spring storms, and too many children went to bed hungry when the fishing proved poor. As if summoned by their conversation, Magnus approached their work table, his expression thoughtful. "Girls, you'll both serve tonight at the high table. The Jarl's advisors sent word they want our best presentation. That means clean aprons, braided hair, and minds on your work, not on whispered tales." Alva felt her stomach flutter with nervous energy. Serving at the high table meant close proximity to nobility, to men who held the power of life and death over common folk like her. She had served important guests before, but never a Jarl, never someone whose decisions would shape the course of her entire world. "Will we see him clearly?" Astrid asked, voicing the question they all wondered about. Magnus stroked his beard, considering. The message said he prefers to observe before making grand announcements. Likely, he'll sit with his advisors, watch how we conduct ourselves. A wise approach for a man taking control of an unfamiliar territory. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. Alva helped hang fresh rushes, mixed with lavender and sage to sweeten the air, polished wooden plates until they gleamed, and arranged tables according to strict protocols of honor and precedence. The kitchens filled with the aroma of roasting meat, baking bread, and simmering stews that would feed the gathering multitude. As evening approached, villagers began arriving in their finest clothes, wool dyed in rich blues and greens, silver brooches that had been family treasures for generations, braided leather belts that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Farmers arrived alongside fishermen, craftsmen brought their families, and even the traveling merchants who had been delayed by spring rains joined the celebration. The great hall transformed as torches were lit and placed in their iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that made the carved dragons seem alive. The warmth of the flames mixed with the heat of bodies and conversation, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and community that Alva had always loved about feast nights. But tonight felt different. Everyone seemed to speak in hushed tones about their new leader, speculating about changes he might bring, wondering if he would prove as generous as the previous Jarl had been neglectful. Some spoke with hope, others with the caution that came from hard experience with powerful men who made promises easily but kept them rarely. As Alva tied her cleanest apron and checked her reflection in the polished copper pot Magnus used for ceremonial occasions, she found herself wondering about the man who would soon hold their fates in his hands. Would he see past the simple clothes and calloused hands to recognize the worth of his people? Would he understand that true wealth lay not in gold, but in the loyalty of those who worked the land, fished the waters, and kept the ancient traditions alive? The sound of horns announced the beginning of the feast, and Alva took her place among the serving staff, her mother's wooden spoon tucked safely in her apron pocket like a talisman. She had no way of knowing that across the hall, standing quietly in the shadows near the great hearth, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes was watching the celebration and thinking remarkably similar thoughts about the people he had returned to lead. Ragnald Thorsson had arrived in Eldrvik 3 days earlier, not in the grand procession his advisors had planned, but quietly, like a hunter returning from a long journey. He had wanted to see his inheritance through the eyes of an ordinary man before he claimed the throne that was his birthright. What he found both saddened and inspired him. The village bore the scars of neglect, streets that needed repair, buildings that wanted fresh timber and thatch, a harbour that could support twice as many boats, if properly maintained. But he also saw something precious in the way neighbours helped each other, in the pride craftsmen took in their work, despite having worn tools, in the laughter of children who found joy even in simple games. He had spent his youth dreaming of adventure in distant lands, fighting alongside kings and learning the arts of war and leadership. But now, at 32, with silver beginning to thread through his dark beard and scars, mapping the stories of a dozen campaigns across his body, he understood that the greatest challenge lay not in conquering foreign enemies, but in earning the trust of his own people. Standing now at the edge of his own welcoming feast, dressed in simple wool that would not mark him as different from any traveling warrior, Ragnald watched his subjects celebrate and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Tomorrow he would reveal himself, accept their oaths of loyalty, and begin the work of rebuilding what had been lost. But tonight he simply wanted to be among them as a man, not as a symbol of authority they might fear or flatter. He wanted to see them as they truly were when they believed themselves unobserved by power. The feast had reached its full crescendo when disaster struck. Alva moved gracefully between the tables, refilling drinking horns with mead and ensuring that no guest's plate remained empty. The hall resonated with laughter, storytelling, and the rhythmic pounding of fists on wooden tables as warriors shared tales of battles fought and victories won. She had grown comfortable in the warm chaos, her nervousness about serving at such an important gathering fading with each successful interaction. She noticed him again, the quiet man who stood apart from the celebration, watching with those thoughtful eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Something about his solitude called to her gentle nature. In a hall filled with boisterous companionship, he seemed like a lone wolf who had forgotten how to rejoin the pack. "Join me at feast," she whispered when she approached him, her voice barely audible above the revelry. The words came out more boldly than she had intended, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at her own audacity. The man turned to her with surprise, then smiled a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "I would be honored," he replied, his voice carrying an accent she could not quite place, refined yet warm. What happened next would haunt Alva's dreams for weeks to come. As Ragnald moved to follow her invitation, accepting a seat at one of the lower tables where common folk celebrated, a tremendous crash shook the entire hall. The great iron chandelier that hung above the high table, a massive piece holding 24 burning candles, broke free from its ancient moorings and plummeted toward the assembled crowd below. Time seemed to slow as screams erupted throughout the hall. Warriors dove aside, pulling their companions to safety. But directly beneath the falling chandelier sat old Thorvald the Wise, the village elder whose aged legs could not move quickly enough to escape the crushing weight of iron and flame descending upon him. Without hesitation, the quiet stranger beside Alva exploded into motion. She had never seen a man move with such purpose and speed. He launched himself across 3 tables, scattering dishes and sending mead flying, to reach Thorvald just as the chandelier struck. His powerful arms swept the old man clear, and he twisted his own body to take the impact against his shoulder and back. The sound of metal meeting flesh echoed through the suddenly silent hall. The chandelier's weight drove the stranger to his knees, hot wax and small flames scattered across his clothes and the floor around him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted as people rushed to help, to extinguish the flames, to check for injuries. Alva found herself kneeling beside the man who had just risked everything to save a village elder. His face was pale with pain, and she could see where the heated iron had burned through his woolen tunic to the skin beneath. But his eyes remained alert, concerned more for Thorvald than for himself. "Is he hurt?" were the first words from his lips, even as Magnus and other villagers worked to roll the chandelier away from them both. Thorvald sat up slowly, shaken but unharmed, save for a few scratches. "I live because of you, warrior," the old man said, his voice carrying the weight of profound gratitude. "What is your name, so that I may know who to thank in my prayers?" The stranger hesitated for just a moment, and Alva saw something flicker across his features, a decision being made that would change everything. "I am Ragnald," he said simply. The name rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Whispers began immediately as people recognized the name of their new Jarl, but confusion followed. Quickly. This injured man in simple clothes could not possibly be the nobleman they had come to honor. Magnus pushed through the crowd, his face filled with concern and confusion. "We must get you to the healing woman," he declared, but his eyes kept searching the stranger's face as if trying to solve a puzzle. As willing hands helped Ragnald to his feet, Alva noticed the leather pouch that had fallen from his belt during the rescue. She picked it up, intending to return it, but the weight surprised her. Through the soft leather, she felt the unmistakable shape of a signet ring, heavy, carved, the kind that only nobility carried. Her heart began to race as pieces of an impossible puzzle started falling into place. The refined speech, the way he had carried himself even while trying to blend in, the immediate assumption of authority when lives were at stake. She looked up to find his eyes on her, and in that moment she saw the truth written in his expression, the man she had. Invited to join the feast, the gentle stranger she had thought to comfort with simple companionship was Ragnald Thorsson, the Jarl of Eldrvik. The hall erupted in renewed activity as word spread through the crowd. Some people fell to their knees in belated recognition of their lord. Others pressed forward, eager to witness this unexpected revelation. The carefully planned celebration had become something entirely different, a moment of crisis that had revealed the true character of their new leader. But Alva stood frozen, the signet ring heavy in her palm, trying to process what this meant. She had spoken to him as an equal, had offered him companionship as if he were just another lonely warrior far from home. The memory of her casual invitation, "Join me at feast," now seemed impossibly bold, almost treasonous in its familiarity. Worse, she realized with growing mortification she had been attracted to his kindness, had felt a flutter of connection when he smiled at her. How could she have been so foolish as to mistake the Jarl of Eldrvik for a common man? What must he think of her presumption? As Magnus and others escorted the injured Jarl toward the healing chambers, Ragnald turned back to look at her one final time. Their eyes met across the chaos of the disrupted feast, and she saw something in his gaze that confused her even more, not anger at her mistake, not amusement at her ignorance, but something that looked almost like regret. Then he was gone, swept away by the tide of servants and advisors who had suddenly appeared to tend to their lord's needs, leaving Alva standing alone in the middle of the great hall, with his signet ring burning like a coal in her palm. The feast continued, but the mood had shifted completely. What had begun as a celebration of their new Jarl's arrival had become a tale that would be told for generations, how their lord had revealed himself not through ceremony or proclamation, but through an act of selfless courage that saved the life of the village's most beloved elder. As Alva mechanically resumed her duties, clearing dishes and helping to restore order to the hall, she could not stop replaying the events in her mind. The way he had smiled when she approached him, the gracious manner in which he had accepted her invitation, the explosion of controlled violence when he moved to save Thorvald. She had seen 3 different men in the space of an hour, the gentle stranger, the decisive hero, and the revealed nobleman, and somehow they were all the same person. The realization left her feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as if everything she thought she understood about the world had been called into question. The wooden spoon in her apron pocket seemed to weigh more heavily now, a reminder of her humble origins and the vast gulf that separated her station from his. She was a servant girl, an orphan whose greatest inheritance was a kitchen utensil carved by hands long dead. He was a Jarl, a man who commanded warriors and decided the fates of thousands. Yet the memory of his smile lingered, and she could not quite convince herself that the moment of connection she had felt was entirely imagined. Perhaps for just a few minutes, before duty and revelation interfered, they had simply been 2 people sharing a brief moment of human warmth in a cold world. That thought both comforted and terrified her in equal measure. The morning after the feast dawned grey and misty, matching Alva's troubled mood as she went about her duties in the great hall. Sleep had eluded her through the long night, her mind churning over the events that had transformed a simple celebration into something that felt like destiny intervening in her quiet life. She moved through the familiar routines of cleaning and preparation with mechanical precision, but her thoughts kept drifting to the healing chambers where the Jarl recovered from his injuries. 3 times she had found excuses to pass by those rooms, and 3 times she had lost her nerve and hurried past without stopping. "You're polishing that same spot on the table for the 5th time," Astrid observed, appearing at her elbow with an armload of fresh linens. "Either you're trying to wear a hole through solid oak, or your mind is elsewhere entirely." Alva looked down to find that she had indeed been scrubbing the same section of wood until it gleamed like polished amber. She set down her cloth with a sigh that carried the weight of her confusion. "Did you see what happened last night?" Alva asked quietly, though she knew the entire village was speaking of little else. "The whole hall saw it," Astrid replied, settling beside her friend on the wooden bench. "One moment we're celebrating our mysterious new Jarl, the next we discover he's been walking among us like a common man. And that rescue, I've never seen anything like it. The speed, the way he moved without thinking of his own safety." Alva's cheeks warmed as she remembered the moments before the chandelier fell, when she had approached the quiet stranger with her innocent invitation. "I spoke to him, Astrid. Before anyone knew who he was, I invited him to join the feast." Her friend's eyes widened with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You spoke to the Jarl. What did you say?" "I thought he was just another lonely warrior," Alva explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "He seemed so approachable, kind, nothing like the stories we hear about nobles and their pride." "And he answered you?" "He smiled and said he would be honored to join me." The memory of that smile sent an unwelcome flutter through her chest. "Then everything happened so quickly with the chandelier, and now I don't know what to think." Astrid leaned closer, her expression serious. "Alva, you must be careful. Men of power live by different rules than we do. What might seem like kindness could be something else entirely." Before Alva could respond, Magnus's voice boomed across the hall. "All hands to the kitchens. The Jarl has requested simple fare for breaking his fast, and I'll not have it said that we failed our lord when he's recovering from his injuries." The 2 women hurried to their duties, but Alva's mind remained divided. As she helped prepare a tray of fresh bread, soft cheese, and honey mead, she could not shake the feeling that the simple meal held more significance than its humble contents suggested. "Who will carry the tray to his chambers?" she found herself asking Magnus, trying to keep her voice casual. The head cook studied her with knowing eyes that had observed kitchen politics for more years than Alva had been alive. "I had thought to send Astrid, but perhaps you would be more suitable. You were present when he was injured. He might want to hear how the hall fares this morning." Alva felt her heart begin to race, but she nodded acceptance of the task. Magnus handed her the carved wooden tray, its surface worn smooth by generations of use, and gave her shoulder a paternal squeeze. "Remember, child, he may be a Jarl, but last night he showed himself to be a good man. Speak honestly if he asks you questions, but remember your place. Respect costs nothing, and guards against many troubles." The walk to the healing chambers seemed both endless and far too short. Alva's hands trembled slightly as she balanced the tray, and she had to pause twice to steady herself. When she reached the heavy oak door, she knocked softly and waited for permission to enter. "Come," came the familiar voice from within, and Alva pushed open the door to find Ragnald sitting on the edge of a simple bed, his torso wrapped in clean linen bandages that showed dark stains where healing salves had been applied to his burns. He looked up as she entered, and she saw recognition flicker in his eyes, not the recognition of a lord acknowledging a servant, but something more personal, as if he had been hoping she would come. "You brought food," he observed. and there was warmth in his voice that made her feel less like a servant performing a duty and more like a friend offering comfort to someone in need. "Magnus thought you might prefer simple fare while you recover," Alva replied, setting the tray on the wooden table beside his bed. "Fresh bread and honey, the way my mother used to make for me when I was unwell." The words were out before she could stop them, and she felt her face burn with embarrassment at the overly familiar comparison. But instead of showing offense, Ragnald smiled the same genuine expression that had captivated her the night before. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said gently. "Will you sit while I eat? I find myself curious about the person who was kind enough to invite a stranger to share in celebration." Alva hesitated, every lesson about proper behavior warring with the unexpected invitation, but something in his manner convinced her that this was not a test or trap, but a genuine request for companionship. She perched carefully on the edge of a wooden chair, watching as he tore off a piece of bread and tasted it with obvious appreciation. The domesticity of the moment struck her as surreal. Here sat the most powerful man in their region, eating bread she had helped bake, speaking to her as if they were equals. "How does Thorvald fare this morning?" Ragnald asked, between bites. "I have been concerned for him through the night." "He is well, my lord," Alva replied, then caught herself using his title. "He spent the morning telling anyone who would listen about your courage. I think the entire village has heard the story at least 3 times by now." Ragnald winced, though whether from his injuries or from the mention of his heroics, she could not tell. "I did what anyone would have done in the same circumstances." "No," Alva said quietly, surprising herself with her contradiction. "Anyone might have wished to help, but not everyone would have moved fast enough or been strong enough to make the rescue. And not everyone would have taken the injury upon themselves to spare an elderly man." Their eyes met across the simple room, and Alva felt the same strange connection she had experienced the night before, as if some invisible thread linked them despite the vast differences in their stations. She saw him as more than a title or position of power. She saw the man who had stood alone watching his people celebrate, who had accepted her invitation with grace, who had risked himself for a village elder without hesitation. "You see clearly," Ragnald said softly, and something in his tone made her think he was not speaking only about the rescue. "That is a rare gift." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibilities neither dared voice aloud. Then the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor broke the spell, and they both turned toward the door as Magnus appeared with additional medicinal supplies. Over the following days, an unexpected pattern emerged that set the entire household whispering. Each morning, Ragnald would request the same simple breakfast, and each morning, Alva would be the one chosen to deliver it. What began as coincidence gradually revealed itself as intention, though whether the request came from the Jarl himself or from Magnus's knowing orchestration, no one could say for certain. Alva found herself looking forward to these quiet moments with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. Their conversations began tentatively, focused on safe topics like the weather and the village's daily routines. But gradually, like ice melting under spring sunshine, their exchanges grew warmer and more personal. "Tell me about your childhood in Eldrvik," Ragnald asked one morning as he savoured the honey-sweetened porridge she had prepared. He sat by the window now, his strength returning daily, morning light catching the silver threads in his dark hair. "There is little to tell that would interest a Jarl," Alva replied, settling into what had become her customary chair. "I was orphaned young, raised by the kitchen staff, taught to serve and stay out of the way." "But what did you dream of?" he persisted gently. "When you were a child lying awake at night, what did you imagine your life might become?" The question caught her off guard with its intimacy. No one had ever asked her about her dreams before. Survival had always seemed more pressing than fantasy. But something in his patient attention encouraged honesty. "I used to imagine sailing away to distant lands," she admitted, surprised by her own candor. "Not as a great lady or warrior, but perhaps as a healer or storyteller." someone useful who could see the world beyond these shores. And now, she considered the question carefully, aware that her answer mattered more than simple conversation. Now, I think perhaps home holds more possibilities than I once believed. That maybe adventure isn't always about distant places, but about seeing familiar things with new eyes. Ragnald smiled at her words, and she noticed how the expression softened the hard edges that command had carved into his features. "Wisdom often comes disguised as simplicity," he said. "I spent years chasing glory in foreign courts, only to discover that the greatest challenges lay in my own lands, among my own people." Their conversations revealed layers beneath his public persona that fascinated Alva. She learned that he spoke 3 languages fluently, could read and write in runes and foreign scripts, and had studied law and statecraft as thoroughly as swordplay and strategy. But more importantly, she discovered a man who questioned his own assumptions, who worried about the weight of responsibility, and who genuinely cared about the welfare of those he ruled. "Do you think leadership changes a person?" he asked one afternoon, his bandages finally removed to reveal healing burns that would leave permanent scars. "Or does it simply reveal who they truly were beneath the surface?" "I think it does both," Alva replied thoughtfully. "Power shows us what we value most. Some people discover they value control, others learn they value service. And which do you think I value?" The directness of the question surprised her, but she met his gaze without flinching. "I think you value justice, though it costs you sleep, and kindness, though it makes ruling harder." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, as if memorizing her features. "You see me more clearly than most of my advisors, who tell me only what they think I wish to hear. Perhaps that's because I have nothing to gain or lose by honesty," Alva suggested. "I'm not seeking position or favor, just sharing morning conversation with someone who seems to enjoy it." But even as she spoke the words, Alva knew they weren't entirely true. She was gaining something from these meetings, something precious and dangerous, a connection that made her heart race and her thoughts scatter when he smiled. She was falling in love with a man whose world was as far from hers as the moon from the earth. The realization struck her one morning when she found herself taking extra care with her appearance, braiding her hair with special attention and choosing her cleanest apron. She was primping for a man she could never have, dreaming dreams that could only lead to heartbreak. "You're growing attached to him," Astrid observed one evening as they prepared for sleep in the small chamber they shared beneath the kitchen. "I can see it in the way you smile when you return from his rooms." Alva wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat. "He's unlike anyone I've ever known," she admitted finally. "When he speaks to me, it's as if he truly sees me, not just a servant, but a person with thoughts and feelings worth considering." "That's what makes it dangerous," Astrid warned gently. "Men like him are trained to charm people, to make others feel special and valued. It's part of how they rule." "You think he's manipulating me?" "I think he might not even realize he's doing it. The difference in your positions means he can afford to be kind without risk, while you—" Astrid paused, choosing her words carefully. "For you, kindness from such a man feels like something more than it can ever be." Alva knew her friend spoke sense, but logic seemed a poor defense against the warmth that bloomed in her chest whenever Ragnald looked at her with those thoughtful eyes. She found herself treasuring small moments, the way he thanked her each morning, how he remembered details from their previous conversations, the genuine interest he showed in her opinions about village matters. The situation grew more complicated when Ragnald began appearing in the kitchens during his recovery, claiming he wanted to observe the daily operations of his household. Magnus welcomed his lord's interest, but Alva suspected the real reason for these visits when she caught Ragnald watching her work with the same careful attention he gave to matters of governance. "Your efficiency is impressive," he commented one afternoon, observing as she organized supplies for the evening meal. "You seem to anticipate needs before they arise." It comes from years of practice, Alva replied, conscious of how ordinary her tasks must seem to someone accustomed to commanding armies. Keeping a kitchen running smoothly requires constant awareness of what might go wrong. Leadership requires the same skill, Ragnald mused. Perhaps we have more in common than apparent differences suggest. The comment sent a flutter of hope through Alva's heart, dangerous and foolish as she knew it to be. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that their different worlds might somehow find a way to meet, that the connection growing between them could overcome the barriers of birth and station. But reality reasserted itself quickly when one of Ragnald's advisors appeared, reminding him of a meeting with visiting merchants who had come to discuss trade agreements. She watched him transform before her eyes, the gentle companion of their morning conversations disappearing behind the mask of authority that leadership required. As he left the kitchen, formal and distant once more, Alva felt the gulf between them yawn wider than ever. The arrival of Jarl Eirik Bloodaxe and his entourage from the neighbouring territory of Nordmark brought unwelcome complications to what had become Alva's treasured routine. The visiting nobleman commanded attention with his imposing presence, battle-scarred features, and reputation for ruthless expansion of his holdings. His 20 warriors filled the guest quarters, and his demands for elaborate entertainment stretched the household's resources to their limits. Alva watched from the servants' passages as Ragnald received his guest. In the great hall, noting how her Jarl's demeanour shifted to accommodate the political necessities of the meeting. Gone was the thoughtful, gentle man who shared morning conversations about dreams and philosophy. In his place sat a ruler who matched Eirik's intimidating presence with quiet authority that commanded respect without resorting to threats. "Your territory prospers under wise management," Eirik declared, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "The harbour improvements show vision, and your people seem content with their lot. Such stability makes for profitable alliances." Alva felt a chill at the calculating tone in the visiting Jarl's voice. From her position behind a carved screen that allowed servants to observe without being seen, she could study the interplay between the two powerful men and recognize the subtle tensions beneath their courteous exchanges. "Eldrvik has always welcomed honest trade," Ragnald replied carefully. "Our craftsmen produce goods that find ready markets, and our fishermen know waters that yield bounty in all seasons." "Indeed, but isolated prosperity invites unwelcome attention," Eirik continued, his scarred hand resting meaningfully on his sword hilt. "These are dangerous times, with raiders growing bolder and some territories proving unstable in their loyalties. A man might find security in the friendship of stronger neighbours." The implied threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Alva felt her chest tighten with fear for Ragnald, though she knew he was far from defenceless. Still, the political manoeuvring reminded her sharply of how precarious their peaceful existence truly was. "I value friendship highly," Ragnald said, his tone giving nothing away. "But I find that the strongest alliances grow from mutual respect rather than necessity born of fear." Eirik laughed, but there was little humour in the sound. Spoken like a man who has not yet faced the full weight of leadership's burdens. "You have been Jarl for mere weeks, while I have held power for 15 years. Experience teaches that idealism is a luxury few rulers can afford." As the formal negotiations continued, Alva found herself assigned to serve at the high table during the evening feast. Ragnald was obligated to host for his guest. The responsibility filled her with dread, not because she lacked confidence in her abilities, but because she feared that Eirik's presence would completely transform her interactions with Ragnald. Her fears proved well-founded. When she approached the high table with a pitcher of imported wine, Ragnald barely acknowledged her presence, his attention focused entirely on managing the delicate balance between hospitality and political maneuvering. The easy warmth that had developed between them seemed to have vanished entirely, replaced by the formal distance appropriate between a Jarl and his servant. "Your serving girl moves gracefully," Eric commented, his eyes following Alva's movements with an attention that made her skin crawl. Young and well-formed, does she serve in all capacities? The crude implication hung in the air like a drawn blade. Alva felt heat rise in her cheeks, but training kept her expression neutral and her movements steady as she continued her duties. She dared not look at Ragnald's face, afraid of what she might see there. All members of my household serve with honor and are treated with respect, Ragnald replied, his voice carrying a subtle warning that made Eric smile knowingly. Of course. I meant no offense. It's just that in my experience, a wise lord ensures all his people understand their proper places and duties. Clarity prevents misunderstandings. Alva forced herself to continue serving, but she could feel the weight of both men's attention on her now, and the sensation made her want to flee the hall entirely. She understood that she had somehow become a pawn in their larger game, though the rules and stakes remained unclear to her. When she finally escaped the high table's immediate vicinity, she found Astrid waiting near the kitchen entrance with an expression of concern and anger. "Did you hear what that pig said about you?" Astrid whispered fiercely. "Magnus is furious, but there's nothing he can do without insulting a visiting Jarl." "What did he mean about proper places?" Alva asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "He's testing Ragnald's authority and resolve," Magnus answered quietly, appearing beside them with plates that needed refilling. "Eirik sees opportunity in a young Jarl who hasn't yet proven his strength. He's looking for weaknesses to exploit, and unfortunately, your friendship with our Lord has not gone unnoticed." The words hit Alva like a physical blow. In her naive hope for connection, she had created a vulnerability that enemies could use against the man she was coming to love. The realization filled her with shame, and fear in equal measure. "I should stop bringing his meals," she said quietly, "if my presence causes problems. Running away now would only confirm suspicions," Magnus interrupted gently but firmly. "Better to continue as normal and show that there's nothing improper to hide." But normal felt impossible when every interaction carried new weight and scrutiny. When she brought Ragnald's morning meal the next day, the easy intimacy of their conversations had been replaced by careful formality that broke her heart, even as she understood its necessity. "The weather grows warmer," Ragnald observed, accepting the tray with polite distance. "The fishing boats venture farther from shore each day." "Yes, my lord," Alva replied, keeping her eyes downcast. "The crews expect a profitable season if the weather holds." They spoke like strangers, careful and correct, while her heart ached for the warmth they had shared just days before. She could see the regret in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, but the presence of political enemies in his house made genuine connection impossible. The situation deteriorated further when Eirik extended his visit, claiming urgent business required longer negotiations. His warriors grew restless with inactivity, making crude comments about the local women and treating the servants with casual disrespect that made Alva grateful for Magnus's protective presence. "How long can this continue?" she asked Astrid one evening as they prepared for another tense meal service. "Until Eirik gets what he came for, or until Ragnald finds a way to make him leave without declaring open hostility," her friend replied grimly. "Either way, things will get worse before they improve." Alva nodded, understanding that her personal happiness had become insignificant compared to the larger forces now in motion around them. The tension in the Great Hall reached a breaking point during the third week of Eirik's extended visit. What had begun as diplomatic courtesy had devolved into a war of wills, with the visiting Jarl making increasingly unreasonable demands, while Ragnald maintained his composure through sheer force of will. Alva watched the careful dance of politics from the margins, noting how Eirik's warriors grew bolder in their behavior toward the household staff. One morning, she discovered young Astrid in tears after one of the visitors had cornered her in the storage rooms and made advances that stopped just short of actual assault. "He said I should feel honored by his attention," Astrid whispered, as Alva helped clean scratches on her arms where she had scraped against rough stone walls while escaping. That a common serving girl was lucky to catch a warrior's eye. Fury burned in Alva's chest, but she knew that reporting the incident would only escalate tensions that were already threatening to explode into open conflict. Instead, she sought out Magnus, who listened to her concerns with the grim expression of a man who had seen such situations before. "We'll arrange for you girls to work in pairs from now on," he decided, "and I'll speak quietly with some of our own men about keeping closer watch. But understand, we must be careful not to provoke an incident that gives Erik excuse for violence." The precautions proved wise when, 2 days later, Alva herself became a target for unwanted attention. She was carrying linens through a corridor when Erik himself stepped from a doorway to block her path, his presence suddenly menacing in the narrow space. "The shy little dove who catches our host's eye," he said, his scarred face creasing in a smile that held no warmth. "I've been curious about what makes you so special that a Jarl forgets proper boundaries." "I serve in the kitchens." "My lord," Alva replied carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the fear racing through her veins. "Nothing more." "Nothing more?" Erik stepped closer, forcing her back against the stone wall. "Then, perhaps you would welcome the chance to expand your duties. I could use someone with your particular talents in my own household." The implication was clear, and Alva felt panic rising in her throat. But before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Ragnald himself appeared around the corner, his expression darkening when he took in the scene before him. "Lord Eirik," Ragnald said, his voice carrying deadly calm, "I trust you are not experiencing difficulty finding your way around my halls?" Eirik smiled, but stepped away from Alva, recognizing the warning in his host's tone. "Not at all. I was simply complimenting you on the quality of your household staff. Such dedication to service is rare." "Indeed it is," Ragnald replied, his eyes never leaving Eirik's face, "which is why I value and protect those who serve faithfully. Alva, I believe Magnus requires your assistance in the kitchens." She fled gratefully, but not before catching the look that passed between the two Jarls, a moment of naked hostility that revealed how close they stood to open warfare. The knowledge that her presence had nearly triggered a conflict between powerful men filled her with guilt and fear. That evening, as she helped prepare what everyone hoped would be Eirik's farewell feast, Magnus pulled her aside with an expression of deep concern. "The situation grows dangerous," he warned quietly. "Erik pushes harder each day, looking for an excuse to claim insult or provocation. Our lord walks a knife's edge, trying to maintain peace without appearing weak." "What does Erik really want?" Alva asked, though she suspected the answer would terrify her. "Submission," Magnus replied grimly. "He wants Ragnald to acknowledge his supremacy, to accept tributary status that would make Eldrvik little more than a vassal territory. And if he can't get that through intimidation, he'll settle for a pretext to take it by force." The feast that night felt like a final test of wills. Eirik's warriors drank heavily and spoke loudly of their own battles and conquests, while Ragnald's men maintained careful discipline despite clear provocation. Alva moved through the increasingly tense atmosphere like a ghost, trying to remain invisible while performing her duties. Near midnight, as the gathering finally began to wind down, she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. Two of Eirik's warriors, deep in their cups, spoke carelessly of plans that were clearly meant to remain secret. "In the morning, after the ships arrive," one was saying, "quick and clean, before anyone realizes what's happening. The old man said it would look like raiders," the other replied. "No one connects it to us, and Eirik gets what he wants without the pretense of negotiation." Alva's hands shook as she continued clearing dishes, her mind racing to understand the implications of what she had heard. Ships arriving in the morning, an attack designed to look like random raiders, Erik's sudden departure that would give him an alibi, the pieces formed a terrifying picture. She had to warn Ragnald, but how could a serving girl approach the Jarl with such serious accusations based on overheard conversations? Who would believe her word against that of visiting nobles? And if she was wrong, the diplomatic consequences could be catastrophic. But if she was right and did nothing, Ragnald and many others could die in a surprise attack, while Eirik stood safely distant, his hands apparently clean of blood. The dilemma tormented her through the remaining hours of service. By the time the last guests had retired to their chambers, she had made her decision. She would find a way to warn Ragnald, regardless of the personal cost. She waited until the small hours before dawn, when the halls lay empty and silent, then made her way quietly to Ragnald's chambers. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she raised her hand to knock, knowing that this moment would change everything between them, one way or another. Before she could lose her nerve, she tapped softly on the heavy oak door and waited for his response, praying that her courage would hold long enough to deliver the warning that might save his life. "Enter," came his voice from within, alertness replacing sleep with the speed of a trained warrior. Alva pushed open the door to find Ragnald sitting up in bed, a knife already in his hand as he evaluated the potential threat. When he recognized her in the doorway, surprise and concern replaced wariness on his face. "Alva, what brings you here at this hour?" "My lord," she began, then stopped, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was about to reveal and the trust she was placing in his hands. "My lord," Alva began again, forcing strength into her voice, "I overheard something tonight that you must know, though I fear you may not believe me." Ragnald set aside his knife and gave her his complete attention, the same focused intensity she had seen him bring to matters of governance. "Tell me everything." The words spilled from her in a rush, the overheard conversation between Eirik's warriors, their talk of ships arriving at dawn, of an attack designed to appear as random raiders while giving Eirik plausible distance from the violence. As she spoke, she watched Ragnald's expression grow increasingly grim. "You're certain of what you heard?" he asked when she finished. "As certain as I can be, my lord." They spoke as men who believed themselves safe from observation, with the carelessness that comes from too much mead and assumed secrecy. Ragnald rose from his bed, already reaching for his clothes with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to sudden action. "If you're right, we have perhaps an hour before those ships arrive. If you're wrong, if I'm wrong, you lose nothing but sleep, and perhaps think less of a servant who spoke above her station," Alva interrupted. "But if I'm right, and I said nothing, the consequences would haunt me forever." He paused in dressing to look at her directly, and in his eyes she saw not the polite distance that had marked their recent interactions, but the genuine warmth that had characterized their morning conversations. "You risk much by coming to me with this warning. Eirik could claim you're spreading lies to damage his reputation. I risk much more by staying silent while good people face danger," Alva replied simply. What happened next shattered every assumption she had made about Ragnald and her place in his world. Instead of dismissing her to summon his advisors and warriors, he moved to a heavy chest and began removing items that made her gasp in recognition. The first was a set of throwing knives, perfectly balanced and deadly sharp, which he strapped to his forearms with practiced efficiency. The second was a short sword, unlike any she had seen in Eldrvik, curved slightly and bearing runes that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. But it was the third item that truly shocked her, a black cloak that seemed to swallow light, made from fabric so fine it moved like water. "You're staring," Ragnald observed as he fastened the cloak around his shoulders. "I've never seen anything like these things," Alva admitted. "They look like the tools of an assassin?" Ragnald finished quietly. "Because that's exactly what they are." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. "I don't understand." Ragnald turned to face her fully, and in the flickering candlelight he seemed transformed into someone entirely different from the thoughtful leader she had come to know. For 15 years before I claimed this title, I served kings and jarls across the northern kingdoms as their hidden blade. When diplomacy failed and open warfare would cost too many innocent lives, they sent me to remove threats quietly and efficiently. Alva's mind reeled as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly clicked into place. His unusual fighting skills, the refinement that spoke of time spent in royal courts, the way he observed people with such careful attention, all of it made sense now. "You were never just a warrior," she whispered. "I was the shadow that kings pretended didn't exist," Ragnald confirmed. "The weapon they could deny using because no one suspected the quiet man in the corner might be the most dangerous person in the room. When my father died and I inherited this title, I thought I was leaving that life behind. But you're going back to it now, tonight. Those skills may be the only thing standing between our people and massacre." He moved to the window and peered out at the harbor, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the horizon. "If Eirik thinks he can use hired raiders to destroy what I've built here, he's about to learn why kings once paid me in gold to solve their impossible problems." The transformation was complete now. Gone was the nobleman who hosted diplomatic feasts and listened to trade disputes. In his place stood a predator whose very stillness radiated lethal intent. Yet somehow Alva felt no fear of him, only for him. "What will you do?" she asked. "What I should have done the moment Eirik arrived," Ragnald replied grimly. "End this threat permanently, before it can spread to threaten other innocent communities." He moved toward the door, then paused to look back at her. "Alva, you saved countless lives tonight with your courage. But now you must promise me something. Stay in the kitchens, stay with Magnus and the other servants, and no matter what you hear happening in the harbor or the Great Hall, do not try to help. What I'm about to do is not something you should witness." "Will you?" she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice her fear. "Will I survive?" Ragnald smiled, and for a moment the gentle man she knew flickered behind the assassin's mask. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, and I've never failed to return when the work was finished. Tonight will be no different." He started to leave again, then turned back one final time. "When this is over, when Eldrvik is safe again, we need to have a conversation that we've both been avoiding. About what's growing between us, about whether the differences in our stations matter as much as we've been telling ourselves they do." Before Alva could respond, he was gone, vanishing into the pre-dawn darkness with the silent grace of his former profession. She stood alone in his chamber, her heart pounding with fear and hope in equal measure, trying to process the earth-shattering revelations of the past few minutes. The man she had fallen in love with was not who she had thought him to be. He was something far more dangerous and complex, a ruler who had once been death incarnate, a leader who could kill with his bare hands, but chose instead to build and protect. The knowledge should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a fierce pride and deeper understanding of the burdens he carried. Outside, the first sounds of conflict began to echo from the harbor as Ragnald's hidden war commenced. Alva pressed her hands to her heart and whispered a prayer to any gods who might listen, begging them to bring him safely through the darkness he was about to embrace. As she made her way back through the silent corridors toward the kitchens, Alva's mind churned with the implications of what she had learned. Every interaction she'd had with Ragnald took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his hidden past. The careful way he observed people, the controlled grace of his movements, the depth of knowledge about human nature that had impressed her, all of it made sense now. She thought of the morning conversations they'd shared, how he had asked her about her dreams and listened to her answers with such focused attention. Had he been studying her then, the way he might study a target or a potential threat, or had those moments been genuine respite from the weight of secrets he carried? The sound of steel meeting steel drifted through the narrow windows, followed by shouts and the splash of bodies hitting water. Alva quickened her pace, desperate to reach the safety Magnus represented, but also terrified of what the sounds might mean for Ragnald's fate. She found the kitchens in controlled chaos, with Magnus directing servants to secure food stores and bar the heavy doors. Astrid rushed to embrace her when she appeared, relief clear on her young face. "Where were you?" Astrid demanded. "Magnus sent men to look for you when the fighting started." "I was delivering a message," Alva replied, which was true enough without revealing the full complexity of her midnight encounter. "What's happening?" "Raiders in the harbour," Magnus answered grimly, though something in his expression suggested he suspected more than he was saying. "Our Lord is dealing with the threat, but he ordered all non-combatants to shelter until it's finished." Through the kitchen windows, they could see occasional flashes of light that might have been torches or weapons catching moonlight. The sounds of battle seemed to move systematically through the harbour area, as if someone was methodically eliminating resistance rather than engaging in chaotic combat. "It sounds almost organized," Astrid observed, unconsciously voicing Alva's own thoughts. "Not like the wild attacks we hear about from other settlements." Magnus nodded slowly. "Our Jarl knows his business when it comes to warfare. Best we trust him to handle whatever threats face us tonight." As if summoned by their conversation, the sounds of fighting began to fade, replaced by the crackle of flames from what might have been burning ships and the distant shouts of men calling orders rather than battle cries. The organized nature of the aftermath suggested victory rather than defeat, but Alva wouldn't allow herself to hope until she saw Ragnald return safely. The wait stretched endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour, as they listened for sounds that might indicate whether their lord lived or died in the darkness beyond the kitchen walls. Alva found herself clutching her mother's wooden spoon like a talisman, desperate for any connection to comfort in the midst of uncertainty. When the kitchen door finally opened, it revealed not Ragnald, but one of his trusted warriors, a man named Olaf, whose grim face had been lightened by obvious relief. "The threat is ended," he announced simply. "The Jarl sends word that all may return to normal duties. The harbour is secure, and there will be no further danger tonight." "And our lord?" Magnus asked the question that burned in all their hearts. "Unharmed and attending to the aftermath," Olaf replied. "He asks that morning meal preparations proceed as usual. He expects to break his fast at the customary time." The familiar routine grounded Alva even as her heart soared with relief. Whatever horrors the night had contained, Ragnald had survived them and was already thinking ahead to the ordinary business of leadership. The man who could slip away to become death itself was also the ruler who ensured his people's daily needs were met. As dawn broke fully over Eldrvik, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Alva began preparing the simple meal that had become their morning ritual. But now she understood that this routine meant something different than she had realized. It was Ragnald's way of anchoring himself to the peaceful life he had chosen, of remembering who he wanted to be, rather than who he had been forced to become in the darkness. The morning after the harbour incident dawned crisp and clear, but an undercurrent of tension ran through the great hall like electricity before a storm. Ragnald had returned before sunrise, showing no visible signs of the violence he had participated in, yet something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the household. Alva carried his breakfast tray with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of shared secrets and unspoken understanding. When she knocked on his chamber door, she found him standing by the window, fully dressed in his formal robes, watching the harbour where smoke still rose from the remains of burned ships. "Come in," he said without turning, and she noticed that his voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. She set the tray on his table as she had done dozens of times before, but this morning the familiar routine felt charged with new meaning. When he finally turned to face her, she saw in his eyes the cost of returning to his former profession, even for a single night. "The raiders are gone?" she asked quietly, though she knew the answer. "They will trouble no one again," Ragnald replied simply. "Nor will their employer face temptation to hire others for similar work." The implications hung between them, unspoken. Eric Bloodaxe's sudden departure before dawn, the messages arriving from Nordmark expressing regret over the tragic raider attack that had claimed several lives, including some visiting warriors, the carefully orchestrated timing that gave the neighboring Jarl perfect alibi while eliminating the immediate threat to Eldrvik. "Do you regret it?" Alva found herself asking, surprising them both with her boldness. Ragnald considered her questions seriously, as he considered all her inquiries. "I regret the necessity. I regret that some men choose paths that make violence the only solution, but I do not regret protecting innocent lives, even if the cost was returning to methods I had hoped to leave behind." He moved to the breakfast tray and broke off a piece of bread. But Alva noticed that his appetite seemed diminished by the weight of recent actions. "There's something else," he continued after a moment, "something that changes everything between us, and I'm not certain how to proceed." Alva's heart began to race, sensing that they stood at the edge of the conversation he had promised before disappearing into the night. "Tell me, last night, when you came to warn me of the danger, you showed courage that saved not just my life but the lives of everyone in this village. You proved yourself worthy of trust that goes beyond the relationship between a Jarl and his servant." He set down the bread and turned to face her fully. "But more than that, in the darkness before the fighting began, when I was preparing to become something terrible and necessary, the thought of returning safely to share morning conversations with you was what kept me anchored to the man I want to be, rather than the weapon I once was." The words struck Alva like lightning, illuminating feelings she had tried to suppress and possibilities she had deemed impossible. "My lord, Ragnald," he corrected gently. "When we're alone like this, just Ragnald. Because what I'm about to ask requires honesty between equals, not the careful distance that rank demands." Alva felt the world shifting around her, old certainties crumbling to make room for something unprecedented and fragile. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you could see yourself as more than a servant in this hall. If the connection we've built over these morning conversations means as much to you as it does to me. If you would consider—" He paused, seeming to gather courage for words that would change both their lives. "If you would consider becoming my wife." The proposal hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Alva stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of what he was offering and the complications it would create. "You're asking a kitchen servant to become the Lady of Eldrvik," she said slowly. "The political implications alone would be my concern to manage," Ragnald interrupted. "Yes, there would be challenges. Some among the nobility would object to my choice, claim that I should seek alliance through marriage to another Jarl's daughter. But last night reminded me that life is uncertain and short, and that spending it with someone who sees me clearly, all of me, including the darkness, matters more than political convenience." Alva's mind raced through the practical obstacles such a union would face. The social barriers, the political complications, the expectations that would fall upon her shoulders if she accepted a position she had never been trained to fill. But beneath those concerns ran a deeper current of possibility that made her heart sing with hope. "You would face opposition from your advisors," she warned, "from other nobles who expect you to marry within your class." "Let me worry about managing those expectations," Ragnald replied firmly. "What I need to know is whether you could be happy as my partner in ruling this territory, whether the love I see growing between us is strong enough to withstand the pressures that would come with such a choice." The word love sent warmth flooding through Alva's chest. To hear him acknowledge what they both felt but had never dared name made the impossible suddenly seem within reach. "I would need time to consider," she said carefully, though her heart was already shouting its answer. "Such a decision affects not just us, but everyone in Eldrvik. If I prove unequal to the responsibilities—" "You won't," Ragnald said with quiet confidence. You've shown wisdom in our conversations, courage when danger threatened, and compassion in your daily interactions with others. These are the qualities that make a good leader, regardless of birth or training. Before she could respond, a sharp knock on the chamber door interrupted their conversation. Ragnald's expression darkened as he recognized the urgency in the sound. "Enter," he called, and the door opened to reveal Olaf with news written in worried lines across his weathered face. "My lord, riders approach from the east, 3 ships worth of warriors, flying Jarl Erik Iron Fist's banners. They'll reach our shores within the hour." Alva felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Erik Iron Fist ruled the largest territory in the region, commanding resources that dwarfed even Eirik Bloodaxe's forces. If he came seeking war over last night's events, Eldrvik could not hope to resist his might through conventional means. "How many men?" Ragnald asked, his voice shifting back to the crisp authority of command. "Near 200, my lord, armed for battle and moving with purpose." Ragnald nodded grimly, already calculating odds and possibilities. "Summon the council. Prepare our defenses, but do not appear openly hostile. We need to understand his intentions before we act." As Olaf departed to carry out his orders, Ragnald turned back to Alva with an expression that mixed regret and determination. "I'm afraid our conversation must wait. Whatever Erik wants, this day will likely determine the future of everyone in Eldrvik." But as Alva prepared to leave his chambers, Ragnald caught her hand gently. "Whatever happens in the hours ahead, know that my feelings won't change. When this crisis passes, I still want your answer to my question." Alva squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the connection between them. "And you'll have it. But first, we must ensure there's still a future for both of us to share." As she made her way back to the kitchens, Alva's mind whirled with the dual revelations of the morning, the proposal that could transform her entire existence, and the approaching threat that might end it before she had the chance to embrace such possibilities. The man she loved had offered her everything she had never dared dream of wanting, but only if they could survive what was coming toward them across the grey waters of the morning sea. The great hall erupted into controlled chaos as word spread of the approaching fleet. Warriors checked weapons and armor while servants secured valuable items and prepared for potential siege. Magnus organized the kitchen staff with military efficiency, ensuring food stores were accessible but protected, and that emergency supplies were distributed to secure locations throughout the hall. "Erik Iron Fist doesn't travel lightly," Magnus observed grimly as he directed servants in moving barrels of preserved meat to storage rooms that could be defended if necessary. "If he's come calling with 200 warriors, he's either planning war or making a statement that's meant to intimidate our lord into submission." Alva helped with the preparations, while part of her attention remained fixed on the windows overlooking the Partnose harbor. From her position, she could see Ragnald's banner flying from the watchtower, the blue and silver wolf that represented his house, but she wondered how long it would continue to wave if Erik decided to claim Eldrvik by force. Astrid appeared at her side, carrying armloads of linens that would serve as bandages if the day turned violent. "Do you think our Jarl can handle such odds?" her friend asked quietly. "I think he's more dangerous than anyone realizes," Alva replied, remembering the transformation she had witnessed in the pre-dawn hours. "But even the most skilled warrior can't fight 200 men alone." "Perhaps he won't have to," Magnus said, approaching with a thoughtful expression. "Erik Ironfist didn't build his reputation through reckless aggression. He's a careful man who calculates costs and benefits. If he wanted to simply destroy Eldrvik, he wouldn't announce his arrival with banners flying. He would attack without warning, like a true raider." The observation offered some hope, but Alva couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's events had set larger forces in motion. Eirik's failed scheme and subsequent death had created a power vacuum in the region, and nature's law said that such vacuums were quickly filled by those strong enough to claim them. A horn blast from the harbour announced the arrival of Eric's fleet, 3 massive longships that dwarfed the local fishing boats like wolves among sheep. From the kitchen windows, they could see warriors disembarking in organized formations that spoke of professional military discipline rather than the chaotic energy of raiders. "They're not preparing for immediate assault," Magnus noted with relief. "Look, they're forming honor guards, not battle lines." Alva followed his gaze and saw that he was correct. The warriors were arranging themselves in ceremonial formation rather than tactical positions, suggesting that Eric had come to parley rather than pillage. But she also noticed the subtle positioning that would allow rapid deployment if negotiations turned sour. A messenger arrived in the kitchens with instructions from Ragnald. "Prepare a formal welcoming feast, but be ready to secure all preparations instantly if the situation deteriorated." The careful balance between hospitality and caution reflected the delicate political maneuvering required when dealing with someone as powerful as Eric Iron Fist. As Alva helped arrange the great hall for the unexpected gathering, she found herself studying the familiar space with new eyes. If Ragnald's proposal became reality, this hall would become her domain to manage, these people her responsibility to protect and serve. The weight of such potential duty both thrilled and terrified her. "You look thoughtful," Astrid observed as they set the high table with the finest plates and ceremonial drinking horns, "more so than usual, even given the circumstances." Alva wanted to share the momentous conversation she'd had with Ragnald, but the presence of other servants and the uncertainty of their current situation made such confidences impossible. Instead, she focused on the immediate preparations, trying to create an environment that would encourage peaceful negotiation rather than hostile confrontation. When Eric Ironfist finally entered the Great Hall, his presence dominated the space like a force of nature. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and arms that looked capable of breaking men in half. His iron-grey beard was braided with rings of actual iron, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had never lost a battle. But what struck Alva most was not his physical intimidation, but the way he observed everything with the same careful attention she had learned to associate with Ragnald's hidden profession. Here was another dangerous man who had learned to read people and situations with deadly accuracy. Ragnald met his guest with perfect diplomatic protocol, showing neither fear nor excessive deference as he welcomed Eric to his hall. The 2 men studied each other like master chess players contemplating their opening moves, each seeking advantage, while revealing nothing of their true intentions. "Lord Eric," Ragnald said formally, "Eldrvik welcomes you. Your reputation precedes you across the northern territories." "As does yours, young Jarl," Eric replied, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "Recent events have made your name the subject of considerable discussion among my advisors." The words hung heavy with implication, confirming Alva's fears that last night's violence had attracted attention from far beyond Eldrvik's shores. She watched from her position among the serving staff as the 2 most powerful men in the region began a verbal dance that would determine the fate of everyone in the hall. As the formal negotiations began, Alva found herself torn between hope for peaceful resolution and terror at the forces now in motion around them. The morning had begun with a proposal that could change her life forever, but it might end with a conflict that would destroy everything she had come to cherish about her home in Eldrvik. Standing in the hall where she had first met Ragnald, watching him navigate dangers that could crush them all, Alva finally understood the true weight of loving someone whose choices shaped the destinies of thousands. Whatever answer she gave to his proposal would bind her not just to the man, but to the responsibilities and dangers that came with standing beside a ruler in an uncertain world. The tension in the Great Hall grew thick enough to cut as Eric Ironfist and Ragnald faced each other across the high table, their words carrying the weight of potential warfare. Alva moved through her serving duties with practiced invisibility, but her attention remained fixed on every nuance of the conversation that would determine all their fates. "Your recent handling of certain difficulties has been most impressive," Eric said, his pale eyes never leaving Ragnald's face. "The raiders who troubled your harbor met swift justice, I'm told, as did certain visitors who may have encouraged their activities." Ragnald's expression revealed nothing as he responded. "Eldrvik protects itself from all threats, whether they come from the sea or from closer to home." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Eric smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "In fact, I find myself curious about the methods employed. Very professional, almost as if someone with specialized training had taken personal interest in removing these problems." Alva felt ice form in her stomach as she realized Eric was probing for information about Ragnald's hidden past. The visiting Jarl's intelligence network was clearly more extensive than anyone had realized. "Tell me, young Jarl, what do you know of a man called the Winter Wolf? A legendary figure who served various kings as their special problem solver?" The name hit Ragnald like a physical blow, though he controlled his reaction to the barest flicker of recognition. But Alva caught the momentary tension in his shoulders, the slight tightening around his eyes. "Stories travel far and grow in the telling," Ragnald said neutrally, "but not every warrior carries the Winter Wolf's signature blade, or knows the precise techniques that left those raiders arranged in patterns that spoke of professional execution rather than chaotic battle." Eric reached into his cloak and withdrew a piece of parchment, placing it on the table between them. "I received this message from King Harald's court. It seems the Winter Wolf has been missed since he disappeared 2 years past. Some wondered if he had simply retired to somewhere quiet." Alva's hands shook as she refilled drinking horns, her heart pounding with the realization that Ragnald's hidden identity was being systematically exposed. "The Winter Wolf was said to be unmatched in single combat," Eric continued, "capable of eliminating any target, vanishing like smoke when the work was done, but also a man of honor who never took contracts against innocent people, someone who eventually grew weary of killing and sought a different path." "I wonder," Eric mused, "what such a man might do if threatened with exposure, if his carefully constructed new life was placed in jeopardy." The implicit threat hung in the air, like a blade poised to fall. Eric was making it clear that he intended to use this knowledge as leverage. "Perhaps such a man would ask what price silence commands," Ragnald said quietly. Eric's smile broadened. "Ah, now we approach honest negotiation. What I want is simple vassalage. Eldrvik becomes a tributary territory under my protection. You remain as local administrator, but acknowledge my supremacy. In return, certain secrets remain buried." The demand struck like a thunderbolt. Eric was offering the same choice Eric had tried to force: surrender independence or face consequences. "And if I refuse?" Ragnald asked. "Then word spreads that the Winter Wolf has been found. King Harald would pay handsomely for such information. Other rulers might seek to reclaim your loyalty through less pleasant means. And there are many who suffered losses due to your activities who would welcome revenge." Alva watched in horror as the trap closed around the man she loved. Eric had maneuvered them into a position where refusal meant not just war, but exposure of secrets that would make Ragnald a hunted man forever. "I require time to consider your proposal," Ragnald said finally. "Of course. Shall we say until sunset?" That should provide adequate opportunity for reflection. As the negotiation concluded and Eric's warriors were shown to quarters, Alva caught the look Ragnald sent her across the hall, a message of regret and determination that made her heart race with fear. She recognized the expression from the night before, when he had prepared to become the Winter Wolf. He was planning something desperate. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Eldrvik as Eric's deadline drew closer. Alva found herself unable to concentrate on her duties, consumed with dread over what desperate plan Ragnald might be formulating. Unable to bear the uncertainty, she made her way to his chambers as the sun began its descent. She found him standing before an open chest, methodically checking weapons and tools. This time, there was something final in his movements, as if he were preparing for a journey from which he did not expect to return. "You're going to kill him," Alva said quietly. Ragnald paused to look at her, and she saw in his eyes the weight of decisions that offered no good choices. "Erik has left me little alternative. If I submit, Eldrvik loses its independence. If I refuse and allow him to expose my identity, I become a liability to everyone here. My enemies would come seeking the winter wolf. So you eliminate the threat before it can spread. One man dies instead of hundreds," Ragnald confirmed grimly. "It's the same calculation I made for 15 years. Alva moved closer, noting the careful arrangement of throwing knives, the deadly curved blade, the black cloak. "And after, when Erik's warriors discover their leader dead, without Erik to lead them, his force will likely withdraw rather than risk a war they can't win. Most are mercenaries who followed him for profit, not loyalty. You're gambling everything on that assumption. I'm gambling everything regardless," Ragnald said simply. "At least this way, the gamble might preserve Eldrvik's freedom and your safety." The reference to her welfare struck Alva like a physical blow. Even facing impossible choices, Ragnald's thoughts included protecting her. The realization crystallized something growing in her heart. "Don't do this," she said suddenly, surprising them both. Ragnald turned to face her fully. "Alva, not because I think you'll fail," she interrupted. "You probably could kill Erik without his men knowing until morning, but because I finally understand what my answer to your proposal should be." The weapons forgotten, Ragnald gave her his complete attention. "Tell me, this morning, when you asked me to marry you, I was thinking about practical obstacles, political complications, social barriers, my inadequacies for such a position." Alva took a steadying breath. "But watching you prepare to sacrifice yourself for our people's freedom, I realize those concerns miss the most important point." She moved closer, close enough to see the scars mapping his past, the kind eyes that had first drawn her to him. "I love you," she said simply, "not despite the darkness in your past, but including it. You became the winter wolf to protect innocent people, and you're prepared to become him again for the same reason. That's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to honor." Ragnald's carefully controlled composure cracked, revealing vulnerability beneath his lethal competence. "Even knowing what I've done, what I'm capable of, especially knowing that," Alva replied firmly, "because you chose to use those capabilities for protection rather than conquest, for justice rather than personal gain. That makes you exactly the kind of man worthy of love." She reached out to touch his face, feeling the roughness of beard and warmth of skin. "My answer is yes, Ragnald Thorsson. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stand beside you as lady of this territory. Yes, I'll share whatever future we can build together." For a moment that lasted eternity, they simply looked at each other across the space that had separated servant from lord, dream from reality. Then Ragnald stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, holding her with desperate tenderness. "You realize this changes nothing about Erik," he said softly against her hair. "The threat remains, and I still see no alternative to eliminating it." "Actually," Alva replied, pulling back to meet his eyes, with a smile that held secrets of its own, "I think there might be another way. Something that uses your reputation rather than hiding from it." Ragnald raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite their situation. "Explain. What if Erik's knowledge of your identity became an asset rather than a weakness? What if the Winter Wolf chose to step out of the shadows, not as a hunted fugitive, but as a protector publicly claiming his territory?" As Alva began to outline her audacious plan, Ragnald felt hope kindle in his chest for the first time since Erik's arrival. Perhaps there was indeed a third path, one that required courage rather than stealth, truth rather than deception. The great hall of Eldrvik had never witnessed a scene like the one that unfolded as the sun touched the western horizon. Eric Iron Fist sat at the high table with confidence when the doors swung open to reveal Ragnald entering not as a cornered Jarl, but as something far more dangerous. He wore the black cloak that had become legend across the northern kingdoms, and at his side hung the curved blade that had ended the lives of tyrants from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. Most significantly, he walked with Alva beside him, her servant's dress replaced by a gown of deep blue that marked her as a woman of station. "Lord Eric," Ragnald said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "I have considered your proposal carefully, and I've reached my decision." Eric leaned forward with satisfaction. "And I refuse." The words dropped like stones into still water. Eric's face darkened with disbelief. "You refuse, even knowing what exposure will cost you?" Ragnald smiled, and something in the expression made even Eric's warriors step backward. "You misunderstand the situation. I'm not hiding from my identity anymore. I'm embracing it." He moved to the hall's center, ensuring every person would hear his words. "I am Ragnald Thorsson, rightful Jarl of Eldrvik. But before I claimed this title, I served the northern kingdoms for 15 years as the man they called the Winter Wolf. I eliminated threats that diplomacy could not touch, protected innocents that warfare could not save, and brought justice to those who thought themselves beyond its reach." A murmur ran through the hall as people processed this revelation. Some looked shocked, others frightened, but many, particularly those who had suffered under negligent leadership, looked intrigued rather than appalled. "You seek to use this knowledge as a weapon against me," Ragnald continued, his gaze fixed on Eric. "But you have made a fundamental error. The Winter Wolf was never a criminal hiding from justice. He was justice, walking in shadows because that was where he was most needed." Eric's confidence cracked. "You cannot simply declare yourself beyond consequences." "I declare nothing," Ragnald interrupted. "I simply state facts. For 15 years, kings and jarls paid me to solve their most difficult problems because they trusted my judgment, skill, and honor. That reputation does not disappear because I have chosen to apply those qualities to ruling rather than killing." He gestured toward Alva, who stepped forward with transformative dignity. "This is Alva Eriksdottir, who will soon become my wife and your lady. She possesses the wisdom to see past surface appearances to truth beneath, and the courage to stand beside a man, regardless of his past, when she believes in his future." The announcement sent whispers through the hall, but Ragnald continued, "You came here expecting to find a young Jarl vulnerable to intimidation. Instead, you have found the Winter Wolf, protecting what he values most. Ask yourself, in all the stories you have heard about that man, how many tell of him backing down from threats?" Color drained from Eric's face as the implications struck him. He had not cornered a desperate nobleman. He had walked into the domain of the most feared assassin in the northern world and threatened everything the man held dear. "You would not dare," Eric began. "Wouldn't I?" Ragnald's hand moved casually to his sword hilt. "You seem to have forgotten that the Winter Wolf never lost a contract, never failed to complete a mission, and never showed mercy to those who threatened innocent lives. What makes you think age, or title, has changed those characteristics?" The standoff stretched taut between them. Then Eric, recognizing he had overplayed his hand catastrophically, forced his features into diplomatic calm. "Perhaps I have been hasty in my assessment. The Winter Wolf's reputation has always been formidable, and I find I have urgent business elsewhere." "How fortunate," Ragnald replied pleasantly. "I would hate for anything to delay your departure." Within an hour, Eric's ships were pulling away from Eldrvik's harbor with panicked haste. The visiting Jarl had realized too late that he had mistaken a sleeping wolf for defenseless sheep. As the foreign warriors disappeared over the horizon, Alva found herself standing beside Ragnald on the harbor dock, watching sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. The man she loved had risked everything on a gamble that truth might prove stronger than deception. "Do you think he'll try again?" she asked quietly. No, Ragnald replied with certainty. Eric knows now that attacking Eldrvik means facing the winter wolf in his own territory, protecting everything he holds precious. That's a fight no sane man would choose. Alva leaned against his shoulder, feeling solid strength once devoted to dealing death, now dedicated to protecting life. And what happens to the winter wolf now? Ragnald considered the question seriously. The winter wolf becomes what he was always meant to be, a guardian rather than a weapon. A protector of the peace we've built here, a defender of the home we'll create together. Magnus appeared at their side, carrying Alva's carved wooden spoon. "My lady," he said formally, offering her the simple kitchen implement, "your inheritance, returned to its rightful place." Alva took the spoon with trembling hands, understanding the symbolic weight. She was no longer a servant accepting charity, but a lady claiming heritage. The humble tool that had once represented her lowly station now stood for the values she would bring to her position: nurturing, service, and wisdom to find strength in simple things. "Thank you, Magnus," she said softly. Then, looking at Ragnald with eyes holding all the love and trust in the world, "Shall we go home?" Together, they walked toward the great hall where their wedding would be celebrated, where they would rule side by side, where the winter wolf would finally find the peace he had spent a lifetime earning. Behind them, daylight faded into gentle darkness, and ahead lay all the bright possibilities of a future built on love, truth, and the courage to be exactly who they were meant to be.